everybody. Today we will be talking about herpes viruses. It's one of the viruses having varied number of viruses which causes both types of infection, genital as well as oral, and it's something which we see in day-to-day our routine life. Somebody or the other is getting infected through this. It's a simple, these are the viruses which could be diagnosed even on the base of clinical this. So with that background, let me start with the herpes virus. So what we will see throughout this 1 hour is what are the properties of these viruses, how do we classify them, and what are their clinical significance, as I said, because we will be dealing somehow or the other in your career, you will definitely see some herpes virus, and many of the times you must have seen also. So what is the properties of this group of viruses is they are unique in establishing latent or persistent infection in the host. That means they keep silently hidden in the body once you are susceptible, and as soon as our immune system or response goes down, they just flare up, or they can be triggered up by a few of the things. That's how we say it is latent. They do go on periodic reactivation, right? So if we see the morphology, they are large, 150 to 200 nanometer in size. They are spherical with ecosahedral symmetry. You can see in the photograph very well seen. Inside it, there is linear double-stranded DNA having 125 to 240 kilobase pairs, nucleosides, which are surrounded by a capsid which is made up of 162 capsomeres. If you see the diagrammatic given here, the outer is the envelope. The green knobs are the glycoprotein spikes, the knobs. Then is the pinkish peach color layer, which is a thick layer, that is the lipid. All these components both together make the envelope. Now when you have envelope antigens and glycoprotein spikes, this is how where you use them as a target, maybe for diagnostic purposes, for vaccine purposes, for killing them, neutralizing. So these are the significance which you should think whenever you are seeing some viruses like this. Now going inside it is a tegument, and inner core is the linear double-stranded DNA, so which is surrounded by ecosahedral capsid, which we said there are around 162 capsomeres individual if we count. Okay, so they are enveloped lipoproteins in nature. Lipid is derived from the nuclear membrane itself, while the protein part is made up of glycoprotein spikes, which I was telling you could be utilized for many of the purposes, and they are 8 nanometer long, and they are fixed inside or get inserted into the lipid part. Okay, that's how they are fixing there. Now the tegument is nothing but an amorphous substance which gives an asymmetric structure between the capsid and the envelope, which is very well appreciated. If you see this, there is all these purple color balls, which is an amorphous material. Now unique feature of these herpes DNA viruses, the genome of them contains several reiterated or repeated genes. Okay, that's also called reiterated, which undergoes sequence arrangement between the different members or the class of herpes. There is no DNA homology between the members except the herpes simplex 1 and 2. They have almost 50% of DNA sequence or homology. Okay, so that's how they are very closely associated. And secondly is herpes 6 and 7. They have around 30 to 50% homology. Okay, now coming to the replication part of viruses, these herpes virus the replication takes place in the host cell nucleus and is similar to the replication which is we see in double-stranded any other DNA viruses. The only difference is that the linear double-stranded DNA of herpes virus becomes circular once it is inside the host cell, and they start replicating by a rolling cycle mechanism. That's a type of mechanism of its division. Now going to its classification, they are classified as alpha, beta and gamma. Okay, if we see one by one, the alpha has The subfamily is Herpesvirini, and their duration and replication and cytopathology is usually short hours, around half a day, you can say 12 to 18 hours. They have cytolytic effects, and their site of latency is neurons. So they are hidden inside or silent inside the neurons. And what do they cause? They are divided again in a two group, simplex viruses and varicella viruses. Right? This is what we are talking around. Herpes simplex 1 or human herpes 1 is the species, and the other is human herpes simplex type 2, right? One is affecting the oral part and second is the genital part. The other is varicella virus, which is also called human herpes 3. It's also called as varicella zoster virus. Now these are more prevalent in Western world. They do similar cause shingles, and it's a very painful condition when they affect nerves, and they even affect eyes, and those are the times which you will see later on when we see the clinical presentation. The patient is in real pain, okay, and it needs immediate attention. You just can't ignore. And at the same time, when you see one varicella zoster clinical presentation of a patient, you will never forget in your life. They are so typically presentation. Okay. Now coming to the second group, which is a beta subfamily, they are long rather than previous. More than 24 hours is their duration of replication. They have cytomegalic presentation. The other is even longer. They have the other group, which is also called as lymphoproliferative. The name itself will say. Now once you see, they reside or they are latent in two different groups. One is in the glands or in the kidney. The other, the name lymphoproliferative itself says lymphoid tissue and on specially T cells, right? Now you see the group of virus, the glands and kidneys, they are mostly affected. The genus here, it is called cytomegalovirus. The glands here is these submandibular glands and other glands, right? The other lymphoid tissue which is affecting is, the genus is roseolavirus. Now if you see the official name and species name or the layman name, the cytomegalovirus is also called as human herpes 5 or cytomegalovirus, and the roseolavirus is called human herpes 6. It is named as same, and human herpes 7, right? Coming to the gamma subtype, the duration is variable in it, but they are lymphoproliferative. Lymphoid tissue, here instead of T cells, they prefer B cells where they are hidden, and they are again divided into two groups, lymphocryptovirus, which is also human herpes 4, and more commonly called as Epstein-Barr virus, which are again a pre-malignant to nasopharyngeal carcinoma. So you definitely need to deal when you are dealing with such cases. The other is rhabdinoviruses, which is also called as human herpes 8, associated with Kaposi sarcoma, which is associated with herpes virus, and these we all know are one of the association in AIDS syndrome, right? In later stage of HIV infected patient, you may have a clinical presentation of Kaposi sarcoma where whole the skin and the tissue is infected. They have black eschar and the presentation is different. Now going one by one, let's talk of herpes simplex virus. They belong to, we saw, alpha subfamily of Herpesviridae. They're extremely widespread and exhibit a broad host range. But the human herpes virus infects only human. They replicate in less than half a day or maybe 18 hours. They spread fast. They are cytolytic. And as I said, that spectrum of diseases, they infect skin, mucosa, as well as various organs. And they undergo latency is neurons or nerve cells. They can reactivate later, causing recurrent lesions, or whenever there is immunosuppression, they just supersede or come up again, flare up. The difference, if we see between HSV 1 and 2, is something it put in a tabulated form so that you can understand better. The transmission of virus 1 is through direct contact with mucosa or a abraded skin, while in herpes simplex 2 it is sexual mode or vertical mode. Vertical means from mother to baby, like that. Okay. The latency here we saw is trigeminal ganglia or neurons, but there it is sacral ganglia. It affects the type 1 affects the younger children, while type 2 is affecting the young adults in more common. Okay. Now if you see the antibody distribution in adults, in type 1 you can see 70 to 90% of people will have antibodies, while herpes simplex 2 only 20% of adults you will see these antibody. How they do present clinically is the herpes simplex 1 will usually present with oral, facial, mucosal lesions. Many of the times when you see there are small pustules or papules like thing at the edge of the mouth or the angle of the mouth. There how you feel that this is the area which is affected. It is oral, facial, mucosal lesions. It can even cause encephalitis and meningitis. So especially in newborns and children, you do see when they have meningitis or encephalitis, one of the parameter you need to rule out is herpes simplex 1. They cause ocular lesion, as I was already mentioning. They can even cause skin lesions above the waist. Now looking at herpes simplex 2, they cause genital lesions, skin lesions below the waist. So one is above the waist and 2 comes below the waist. They may have neonatal herpes by herpes simplex 2. If the mother is infected, while passage, the baby may get infected. Now what are the properties? In egg, if you see chorioatlantic membrane, one will cause smaller pox, okay? But the herpes simplex 2 will make larger pox. So that's how, according to the pox size, you can differentiate when you cultivate them. But when you cultivate them on chick embryo fibroblast, they do not grow well if it is herpes simplex 1. But if it is herpes simplex 2, they will replicate very well. Type 1 is less neurovirulence, like type 2 is more neurovirulent, and type 1 is less drug resistant, while type 2 herpes simplex is more drug resistance. Coming to the antigenic homology, 1 and 2, they show more than 80% of antigenic homology, and in genomic sequence, I already discussed, more than 50% genomic sequence homology is seen between herpes simplex 1 and 2. Now over to pathogenesis. What happens when a person is infected first time having a primary infection? The transmission occurs, we already said, through the skin or abraded skin or the mucosa. They usually replicate, the herpes simplex virus will replicate at local site of infection and produce lesions commonly. In one, they are confined about the waist, which we have said. Most common site is around the mouth, as I said, the edges of the angle or the lips. There you will find small pustules. While in 2, you will find below the waist and mostly in genital area, there are infection. Now how they spread is, they spread through the local nerve ending, and they spread in retrograde axonal flow to dorsal root ganglia, replicate there, and then stay there, undergo latency there. While primary herpes simplex virus infection, they are usually mild and asymptomatic. But if the person is immunocompromised, the viremia occurs, leading to widespread organ involvement, at times may have systemic manifestation. But majority of the times you will see milder infections more prevalent, more common. They do have tendency to hide in neurons, causing trigeminal ganglia. They stay, the 1 and the 2 in sacral ganglia, which we have talked. Now, in their non-replicating state, they do not replicate in latent stage, except for a small RNA called microRNA, which is encoded by latency-associated viral gene, which maintains the latent infection inside the host, and they prevent it for cell to die. If you want to isolate the virus during latency, you cannot, okay? So that is how you don't know if the virus is silently there. Now reactivation can occur through any of these following: fever, anoxal injury, physical injury, emotional stress, exposure to UV light. Via the axonal spread, how the virus goes back to peripheral side, further replicate in skin mucosa and cause secondary lesions. In recurrent infection, what happens is there is less extensive but less severe because of presence of pre-existing host immunity that will limit the local viral application. Many reoccurrences are asymptomatic, but viruses are shed in the secretions. That's how again a person can get infected. This is what I was telling you. You will see the vesicular lesions. Look at the photograph. The inner side is on the lips and on the tongue, which is due to herpes simplex 1. You can very well appreciate these types of papules or ulcers, right? So most common affecting is buccal mucosa, oral facial mucosal lesions, primary lesions causing gingivitis and pharyngitis. There may have recurrent lesion in herpes labius, which is painful vesicles near lips. Other lesions are ulcerative stomatitis or tonsillitis, and many cases are asymptomatic, but they can predispose to secondary infections by bacteria, maybe streptococcus or pneumococcus. So you definitely see these lesions very commonly. They may involve nervous system causing encephalitis, meningitis, or autonomous nervous system is involved in sacral region. Transverse myelitis, rarely you can see Guillain-Barré syndrome. You may even see Bell's palsy where it is affecting the peripheral nervous system. The cutaneous lesion, there may be herpetic vitiligo, febrile blisters, herpes glutearium, eczema herpeticum, or erythema multiforme. This is how they can present. Looking at the photograph, you can see this lesion is involving ocular lesion, which is more common than herpes 2 involved by herpes simplex 1, causing severe conjunctivitis. Recurrent lesion develop into dendritic ulcers of cornea or vesicles of the eyelid, which make a concern. They may have acute keratoconjunctivitis, follicular keratoconjunctivitis with vesicles over the eyelids, right? And may lead to corneal blindness if the corneal stroma may cause opacity and blindness. So HSV-1 infection are second common cause of corneal blindness next to traumatic injury. So this is one when you have ophthalmic patients, you may think of HSV-1. Now genital lesions is more common by HSV-2 than 1. They are usually bilateral, painful, multiple, tiny vesicular ulcers. They may be associated with fever or inguinal lymphadenopathy. So once you see fever and inguinal lymphadenopathy, you must examine thoroughly about the patient and elicit the history. Going to visceral and disseminated herpes, which is less common, but nonetheless you do see when you have immunocompromised patients or underlying malnutrition, or as I said, AIDS, pregnant women, transplant recipient, which is now increased. We have so many transplant surgery. They are at higher risk of developing viremia and disseminated infection. So common manifestations over these will be pneumonitis, tracheobronchitis, as well as hepatitis. Okay, coming to the neonatal herpes, which was much more common previously as now. The transmission is through during birth from the maternal genital tract in utero after birth. The risk of getting neonatal herpes is maximum 10 times more if the mother is recently acquired the infection or having primary infection than those who had recurrent infection. So HSV-2 is more common to cause neonatal herpes, 75% of total cases as compared to HSV-1. Now how do they present? The babies are usually or almost always symptomatic, presenting with one of these. They may have local lesions involving skin, eye or mouth. They may present up with encephalitis, or they may present with disseminated disease involving multiple organs including CNS. And neonate has the highest frequency of visceral infection as compared to others. So there, in neonates, encephalitis, whenever you suspect, you have to subject this CSF for ruling out herpes simplex virus for the causing the encephalitis. Now, if you compare these two epidemiologically, children are affected with 1 as compared to adults in HSV2. The adults antibodies develop 70 to 90% of in adults in HSV1, but they fail to eliminate the virus from the body. Though they have antibodies, but the virus still stays latent in them. While in HSV2, the antibodies develop only in 20% of people, especially it is seen more amongst black women than in men and whites. Most adults become carriers throughout the life, occasionally get transient recurrent attacks, while in HSV2, they tend to recur more often than one, irrespective of what is the site of infection. Now coming to how do we diagnose them? You can diagnose them by a skin preparation and directly see under the microscope. That's a cytopathology. It is also named as Zank preparation, where you stain it them bright or Giemsa stain. Many of the times this photographs and question is asked as in your MCQ type, maybe pre-PG or any of these things. This is one of the good MCQ. Then you do viral isolation. You can go for viral antigen detection by direct immunofluorescence, or you can do herpes simplex virus DNA detection by PCR and real-time PCR. Now this is something which is now fully exploited. We have biofires, we have multiplex PCRs, we have panel PCRs of encephalitis or meningitis, where you can detect it, especially in corporate and good setup laboratory. This is routinely done. The other is antibody detection by ELISA and other formats, though its sensitivity is less. The sensitivity is more for vesicular lesions and primary infection than for ulcerative lesions and recurrent infection. This is how the Zank smear of the tissue, which can be seen by McGrunel, multinucleated giant cells, the Zank cell in the smear, scraping, right? So how do you see this scraping is obtained from the base of the lesion, can be stained by bright stain or Giemsa stain, which is called as Zank preparation, or can also do pepiniculus stain where it will look like pink. The sensitivity is less than 30% of mucosal swabs, but it cannot differentiate whether it is due to HSV1 or 2 and varicella zoster virus, as all of them will produce similar characteristics and they will have cytopathological changes like Cowdery type A intranuclear inclusion body, or it's also called Lipschultz body or multinucleated giant cells, or they can even called as ballooning of infected cells or margination of chromatin. These all can be asked in MCQ in different forms at different level. Now, coming back to viral isolation, it is the most diagnostic tool for herpes simplex virus diagnosis. The growth is inside the cell lines, can be detected in 2 to 4 days. By characteristic cytopathic effect, you see diffuse rounding and ballooning of infected cells. The viral antigen detection by neutralization test or immunofluorescence staining can be with specific antiserum, so that you come to know. You even have a shell vial technique which can be followed to decrease the detection time to less than a day. Now, another technique is direct detection by immunofluorescence. You stain with specific antiserum. It is sensitive and specific assay. It can easily differentiate herpes 1 and 2. Coming to DNA detection, PCR is most sensitive. It can differentiate between HSV 1 and 2. And real-time PCRs are done in real time, that is, you keep seeing the amplification at its C. You target the genes, whatever you want to see. As I already said in the start, that glycoproteins can be used, or glycoprotein B or UL30. They are more sensitive assays, the real-time PCR. You can even quantitate the load of how much is the virus by the specimen, and can differentiate between the different types, HSV1 or 2. And as I said, there are multiplex PCRs available, biofire available. Now the diagnosis is more gone towards molecular diagnosis. Antibody detection, antibodies appear in a week time, 4 to 7 days after the infection, and it is peaked in after 15 days to 1 month time. IgM appears first and is replaced by IgG later on, which persists throughout the life once the person is infected. Here you see the fluorescence, indirect fluorescence of HSV1-2 antibody detection. See how beautifully the neurons, you can see the fluorescence color around the apple green color around the background, okay, of the infected cells. Now coming to the treatment, how do you treat once the infection is there? The most commonly you give the antivirals, which is acyclovir, which is the drug of choice. It acts by inhibiting viral DNA polymerase. But for mucocutaneous infection, acyclovir and its congeners like famciclovir and velaclavir can be the mainstay of treatment. But if it is ocular infection, you need topical iodouroxidine or trifluorothymidine or topical vidrabilene or cidofovir as used. Once you have herpes simplex virus encephalitis or neonatal herpes, you have to give injectable acyclovir, which remains the main drug of choice. There are instances of acyclovir resistance where altered substrate specificity of phosphorylation is seen, and phosphocarnate is the drug of choice in such circumstances. So how do you prevent? If one comes across a person of genital herpes, you will advise them to change the lifestyle and utilize the condoms. For neonatal herpes, it can be prevented by prior administration of acyclovir to mothers during 3rd trimester of pregnancy or delivery by elective section. That's how that incidence has come down from previous. No vaccine is licensed right now. Several vaccines have been tried and the trial are going on. Recombinant herpes simplex 2 glycoprotein vaccine, which I said is how you utilize this glycoprotein. Okay, so that was all about herpes simplex 1 and 2. Now coming to another group, which is varicella zoster virus. It produces vesicular eruptions or the rash on the skin and mucous membrane, and you can find two different clinical entities. One is the chickenpox and one is the shingles. You must have heard the chickenpox, but shingles or the zoster is also another word which is more commonly seen in Western world. We had more of chickenpox, right? But you need to understand both. The globe is small. In chickenpox, there is generalized diffuse bilateral vesicular rash following primary infection, and it usually affects children. While the zoster or shingles, they occur following reactivation of latent varicella zoster virus, which is present in the trigeminal ganglia and that occurs mainly in adult life. And these vesicular lesions are unilateral and segmented, confined to the skin innervated by one single sensory ganglion. That's how you can little track it, that it is more of a zoster, right? So what is the pathogenesis of chickenpox? Going one by one. The entry is upper respiratory mucosa or the conjunctiva. It spread and replicates in the regional lymph nodes, spill over it and enter the bloodstream, causing primary viremia. And once there is primary viremia, it's going to spread throughout all systemic organs like liver, spleen, and multiplies there. Again come to bloodstream, causing secondary viremia. And these varicella zoster present in the infected mononuclear cells, and they are then transported to either skin, respiratory, or neuron, where what happens is the virus replicates in the skin in the epithelial cells, causing rashes. It can even cause swelling of epithelial cells, ballooning degeneration, and accumulation of tissue fluids. In the result, they form vesicles. Okay, so either rash or vesicles are formed in the skin. Coming to the respiratory, once they shed in the respiratory secretions, they can transmission of infection occurs. And once they are in the neurons, these varicella zoster virus gains access to neurons of trigeminal ganglia, and then they undergo latency. So how do you see the incubation period is like 2 to 3 weeks. Here is the photograph of rashes of chickenpox, and here is, you can see a very segmental distribution of zoster, rash, right? So typically description is they cause rash and are vesicular, centripetal in distribution, bilateral and diffuse in distribution. The rashes appear in multiple crops. Fever appears with each crop of rash, and disease of childhood, when occurs in adults, it's more severe with bullous as well as hemorrhagic rashes. So the complications, what you see here is the complication will be more common infectious complications causing secondary bacterial infection of skin. Most common extracutaneous complication like CNS involvement. Patient may have cerebral ataxia, encephalitis, aseptic meningitis, and usually occurs in children. And when it is most serious complication, it causes varicella pneumonia, though less, but develops more commonly in adults, maybe around 20% of cases than in children, and is seen in these are severe cases which are seen in pregnant women. It can even cause Reye syndrome, again an MCQ to you. Other complications are myocarditis, nephritis, corneal lesions, and arthritis. Okay, though it is rare, but one need to understand that they can also cause such infections like nephritis, myocarditis, and arthritis and corneal lesions. So once you know it, then only you will think when you see the patients. The chickenpox in pregnancy can affect both the mother as well as fetus. Mothers are at higher risk causing varicella pneumonia, we already talked, but the fetus can develop two types of infection depending on the gestational period when the infection got. If the fetal or conjunctival varicella syndrome infection is early in early pregnancy, or baby may have neonatal varicella when the infection is during delivery time or the closer to delivery duration, that is the third trimester. Coming to the fetal or congenital varicella syndrome, it is highly teratogenic. The risk is maximum when the mother has infection. The acquires infection at early pregnancy, risk of transmission is 25%, and developing into disease is 0.4 to 2% of infants whose mother get chickenpox in less than 13 weeks of gestation, while as compared to 13 to 20 weeks of gestation. Okay. They are characterized by skin lesions, lymph hypoplasia, CNS defects like microcephaly, mental retardation, seizures, ocular defects like chorioretinitis, microophthalmia, cataracts, hydroneurator, hydronephrosis, or neurogenic bladder or low birth weight. Now coming to neonatal varicella, if mother develops chickenpox more than 5 days before delivery, the baby is mostly asymptomatic due to protective maternal antibody in spite of transmission during delivery. If mother develops chickenpox 5 days before to 2 days after the delivery, maternal antibodies would not have produced in such a short time, leads to dissemination of the virus to baby, causing neonatal varicella, a severe form of chickenpox, may have mortality to the extent of 30%. Now, if we see the epidemiology, chickenpox is highly contagious, right? And the period of infectivity is child is infectious from second day before the onset of rash to 5 days thereafter until the vesicles are crusted. Okay. One attack gives lifelong immunity, but the reservoir here is only humans, and the only human reservoirs are the host. And source of infection are patient are the only source, they are no carriers, and secondary attack rate is 70 to 90%. Coming to another group of varicella, which is also called as zoster or shingles. This is due to reactivation of latent varicella zoster virus, which is more commonly seen in older age, more than 60-year age, in immunocompromised individuals, and occasionally in healthy adults. This complain or start with severe pain in the area where the skin or mucosa is supplied by one or more group of sensory nerves and ganglia. There may be rashes which can be unilateral, segmental, confined to the skin, which is supplied by the affected nerves. Most common nerve involved are ophthalmic branch of trigeminal nerve, head, neck, trunk are the most common affected sites. The complications of shingles are post-herpetic neuralgia, zoster ophthalmicus, Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, and visceral lesions. How do we diagnose them in laboratory? You again see the Zank smear, do the Zimta stain, take the material from the ulcer base, and you see cytopathological changes similar to herpes simplex virus infection, and such as formation of multinucleated giant cells. You can do viral isolation and in the cell lines, and it can produce like cytopathic effects as HSV. There is diffuse rounding and ballooning of infected cells. There are specific methods which can be specific antigen detection by direct immunofluorescence staining or PCR technique. Okay. Coming to the vaccine, we do have vaccine for them. The live attenuated vaccine using OCA strain of varicella zoster vaccine is available. In children, given to children after 1 year of age, 2 doses are given. First dose at 1 and 1.5 years and second at 4 to 6 years. Also given to seronegative adults, 2 doses at 1 month gap. Transmission of the vaccine virus can occasionally cause mild rashes in the recipient. Protectivity by the vaccine is more than 80% effective in preventing chickenpox in children, but less so in adults, up to 70%. However, it is 95% effective in preventing severe disease. The drug of choice is acyclovir, can prevent the complication of chickenpox and can even cause halt of zoster in adults, but cannot prevent post-herpetic neuralgia. Coming to varicella zoster immunoglobulin, it is recommended for post-exposure prophylaxis given within 96 hours, preferably within 72 hours, 3 days of exposure. It is also indicated for neonates born to mothers suffering from chickenpox in the onset of chickenpox. If the mother is between less than 5 days before delivery till 48 hours after delivery, the immunoglobulin is not indicated if the mother has zoster. Now, what are the infection control measures? Here you will have to have patient isolated because it's going to transmit. Airborne precautions like negative airflow rooms, or you have plus contact precaution must be followed until unless there is a dry and crust is formed. Till then the patient is infectious. For localized zoster in an immunocompetent host, contact precaution alone can be followed. Cytomegalovirus, it's one of the largest virus in herpes viridae family. It's named because of its massive enlargement of infected host cells. The properties are similar to herpes virus as we discussed earlier. They belong to beta subfamily. There is double-stranded DNA, which is largest among herpes virus. Cytomegaloviruses are species-specific. If you see the cell type specificity in vivo, CMV infects kidney and salivary glands where it undergoes latency. While in vitro, if you see, the CMV will replicate only in human fibroblast cell line and produce characteristic cytopathic effect described as owl's eye appearance. Okay, they do have cell-to-cell spread. Clinically, they will present with array of clinical syndrome. It can having congenital manifestation, prenatal infection, infection in immunocompetent, infection in immunocompromised, and more common now you have to know is transplant recipient because we have lots of transplants now. Now coming one by one, talking of congenital CMV infection, it is most common intrauterine infection associated with congenital defects. About 1% of infants are born infected with CMV, and cytomegalic inclusion disease develop in 5% of infected fetus, and around 5 to 25% of them develop significant psychomotor, hearing, ocular, and dental effects within 2 years of span of life. Now, if you see other defects, the other congenital defects most commonly seen are erypetechiae, hepatosplenomegaly, and jaundice in 60 to 80% of cases. And less common defects can be microcephaly, cerebral calcification, intrauterine growth retardation, and prematurity around 30 to 50%. So where is the maximum risk? Risk is in the early pregnancy, and if the mother is primarily infected during pregnancy, 1/3 of primary infected mother transmit the virus to infants, in contrast to 1% of reactivated mother. So that's a mode which is more common. So transmission to newborn occurs during any of these, either through delivery, infected birth canal, or in postnatal through infected breast milk secretions from mother. They may be asymptomatic but still can shed virus in urine for around 12 weeks, that is 3 months of age up to several years. Few infants, especially premature babies, do develop interstitial pneumonia, though it is pneumonitis, though it is less, but it can be seen. If you see here what happens in immunocompetent adults of mononucleosis-like syndrome is, the agent here is tabulated from the Epstein-Barr virus in infectious mononucleosis, but in mononucleosis-like syndrome, it is CMV accounting for 20 to 50%. It can be HHV6, Toxoplasma, Ehrlichia, or HIV. Atypical lymphocytosis is seen in both, and clinical presentation in infectious mononucleosis, you will have presentation with fever, myalgia, hepatosplenomegaly, exudative pharyngitis, cervical lymphadenopathy, and rashes following ampicillin therapy. While similar presentation except exudative pharyngitis, you will see here, the cervical lymphadenopathy is absent in mononucleosis-like syndrome. Here, how you will differentiate them in clinical presentation. If you see the heterophil antibody, they will be elevated, can be detected by Paul-Bunner test in infectious mononucleosis, while in mononucleosis-like syndrome, they won't be there. A specific antibody to ABV antigens are elevated in infectious mononucleosis, while antibody to CMV or other agents may be elevated there. So what you see in immunocompromised hosts, most of which are due to reactivations, like in untreated AIDS patient, when the CD4 count is less than 50, CMV may cause chorioretinitis, gastroenteritis, dementia, or disseminated CMV infection. Though we are seeing it less now, but one must know because you may have patients like that. In organ transplant recipient, most common viral infections you see is for in 1 to 4 months post-transplantation is bilateral interstitial pneumonia, commonest seen in 15 to 20% when you do bone marrow transplant. Febrile leukopenia is seen among solid organ transplant recipients, and obliterative bronchiolitis is seen in lung transplants. Graft atherosclerosis is seen in heart placenta transplant, and rejection of renal allograft. If we see the epidemiology, the transmission of these viruses through oral and respiratory spread predominantly, though there may be transmission from mother to baby as transplantation route or direct spread, through blood transmission less than 10%, organ transplantation definitely, and sexual contact in younger adults. The reservoir is, humans are the only reservoir host for CMV. Virus may shed in urine, saliva, semen, breast milk, and cervical secretion, and is carried to the circulating white blood cells. It is an endemic worldwide, present throughout the year without any seasonal variation, and risk factors are low socioeconomic status or poor personal hygiene facilitate the infection, and prevalence is higher in underdeveloped nations with 90% being seropositive in contrast to 40 to 70% in the developed nation. If you see the diagnosis, you detect them by inclusion body in the urine. The characteristic perinuclear cytoplasmic inclusion, in addition to the usual intranuclear inclusions, are seen in other herpes virus. Very beautifully you can appreciate here is owl's eye appearance. This again becomes an MCQ. The virus isolation can be done through throat washings or Human fibroblasts are the most ideal cell lines you will prefer for their isolation, and what you see is cytopathic effect, which can be seen in 2 to 3 weeks of incubation, and cytopathic effect may be observed. Typical CMV inclusion, multinucleated giant cells, or enlargement of infected host cells. So shell vial technique can be used in CMV mononucleosis, where viral load is low and cytopathic effect takes several weeks to appear. ELISA antibody detection can be done through serum antibody, but there are few limitations, and the various antigens which can be used for ELISA is matrix phosphoproteins, PP150 or PP65, glycoprotein GB or GH, or major DNA binding protein like PP52. CMV IgM antibodies appear in 1 to 2 weeks after infection, can indicate recent infection or ongoing infection. Drops to below detectable level you can see within several months after the infection. And IgM detection in pregnancy indicates congenital infection, thus guiding that treatment needs to be initiated. While IgG antibodies are produced few days after IgM and they persist lifelong, it indicates either a recent or past infection which can be differentiated by performing IgG avidity test. So just getting IgG, IgM is not a good idea. One must get an IgG avidity test for CMV. Low IgG avidity indicates recent infection, less than 3 weeks. IgG avidity test is also useful in detection or diagnosing congenital infection. Antibody detection will not differentiate strain difference amongst the clinical isolates. So there are many other limitations of antibody detection. Coming to the antigen detection, CMV specific PP65 antigen, which is a major matrix phosphoprotein, can be detected through peripheral blood leukocytes by indirect immunofluorescence using specific monoclonal antibody, but it is done in good reference labs. This test has been in use since long but is less preferred as it is time consuming and technically demanding. So now the world has shifted to molecular diagnosis. So going to the molecular, as I said, PCR detects specific CMV DNA in blood, body fluid such as CSF. You can target different genes, glycoprotein, polymerase or PP65. They're rapid, highly sensitive, specific, and they have replaced the gold standard culture techniques in many of the labs. And real-time PCR and multiplex PCRs can be quantitative, can be doing viral load, and hence a method of choice, even if you want to monitor the treatment response. The treatment does not respond, CMV does not respond to acyclovir. So how do you treat them is ganciclovir, vancomycin, foscarnet or sidovirin, or by CMV immunoglobulin. So antiviral resistance can rarely occur due to mutations in target genes, like UL97 mutations confers resistance to ganciclovir, while UL54 mutations leads to resistance to ganciclovir, sidoforin and foscarnet. So it becomes important to understand whether the person is having resistance to these or not, or these target genes. So that will become now basic amenities before you start treatment to such patients. So it's nowhere far that we will prescribe them as routine test. And again, it becomes your good MCQs for PG or entrance. If you see the prophylaxis, both ganciclovir and valganciclovir have been used successfully for prophylaxis and presumptive therapy in transplant recipients. Immunoglobulins, CMV immunoglobulins have been seen effective in preventing congenital infections when given to mother during pregnancy. So that's what for today. Thank you for patient here.